So this is the PF lecture for the March topic for 2024. My name's Ishaan Ahsaan. I've been doing a PF debate for 3 years at Ardrey Kell.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I've got experience in mostly PF and LD for 3 years competing in various places, but as of now, I am on my own independent.
Okay. So obviously this is a topic lecture for the 2023 top or the 2024 March topic, but we don't want you to take this as your only prep. The purpose of this topic lecture is basically just to focus on understanding just the key concepts. Once again, it shouldn't be the only thing you're doing. It's just to build a foundation. And while we try to go over a few arguments, this doesn't include every argument that you could possibly make on this. And these are just the probably the most common arguments you're going to see. You're going to have to do prep on your own. And you will also probably have to get more background information on your own. And yeah, that'll always help you. That's never going to harm you getting more information. This lecture is just to build a foundation of everything you need to know.
All right, so first we're going to do definitions and then cover the background surrounding the topic of past court cases and legislature. Then we're going to go over F arguments and neg arguments. And probably somewhere in there, we're going to talk about general stasis points of the debate, like central points of clash in the debate that probably should inspire a lot of the arguments you don't see on this slideshow, but that you come up with yourself.
Okay, so starting off with backgrounds. So the resolution is in the United States, collegiate student athletes should be classified as employees of their educational institution. As far as resolutions go, this is a bit of a weird one, especially for PF. We haven't had it. I'm pretty sure there have been sports related.
Viendo un meeting. Oh, ya, ya. Pero sí.
Is okay, Daniel, about that. Okay. We have had sports related topics in the past, but it's been a while. So yeah. And the other weird thing about this topic is that there is no clear actor here. We all know that like what the action is, which is reclassifying institutions or reclassifying student athletes, but we don't know whether this like a court thing, whether it's going to be Congress or whether it's going to be some of the other mechanisms that we're going to talk about later, like the NLRB. The other thing is that most of your impacts will probably be pretty limited in scope, whereas like in other topics, like the single-use plastics topic for this month, you're going to have more global impacts or even countrywide impacts. Here, probably not for most of the arguments you're going to be making. They're probably going to be limited to either college athletes or just college students in general. That being said, there definitely are some arguments that you can increase to affect like on a global scale. There probably are arguments, but most of them are not going to be like that.
Yeah, so definitions um first is what the resolution is targeting collegiate student athletes, and these are athletes that are part-time or full-time students of a college or university that participates in a competitive athletic program. And generally, these will already be under a full scholarship. That might be something that you could use in the future. But in general, they are just people who play sports for a college or university. Pretty simple. And educational institutions are a college or university that a collegiate student athlete is a student of in this context. More generally, it's just any post-secondary educational or just like any post-secondary school. And you might be able to get a little bit liberal with the definition on this one and kind of toe the line of what educational institution specifically means in this context.
Yeah. So I think probably the most important definition on this topic is going to be what's the definition of an employee. So this definition is straight from the IRS, and it's anyone who performs services for a business where the business can control how the service will be done. And what you're probably thinking is like that kind of defines what a student athlete is because they perform services for a college or university, and the college and university can pretty much like they can control when they play, how they play, like what position they play. But you're gonna see later on that this isn't always the case, and this isn't like there are other definitions. But another important part of employees is that they have certain rights under the FLSA, which we'll again get into later, which includes the right to receive equal pay for equal work. So, like, you can't discriminate pay based on things like gender and race. The second thing is that they have accommodation for medical conditions. So if you have an employee with certain disabilities, the workplace has to make accommodations for that. A third thing is that they can participate in lawsuits without retaliation, which means that if an athlete or just in general, if an employee is unsatisfied with something, or they think that that their employer did something legally wrong, they can sue the employer, and the employer can't like terminate them, or they can't cut pay for that. And then the last thing is that they're also given the right to not be discriminated against. Yeah, those are the four major rights that any employee has. So when you're reclassifying a student athlete as an employee, they're going to gain those rights. And that's probably where a lot of AFGround is going to come from. If you read, I'm sure if you read through like the actual documentation of the FLSA, there's definitely more things you can extrapolate from there. But these are the four major things that a student athlete or an employee would have the right to, and a student athlete under the AF world would also have a right to.
Yeah, so the first court case we'll be looking at is NCAA versus Alston. And in this court case, the Supreme Court decided that student athletes could receive compensation from NIL uses, allowing students to make deals with companies. And this already kind of sets a precedent for what student athletes can currently do. They can already make kind of corporate decisions with other institutions. So they do already have the capacity to bring their institutions a lot of money, other than just by playing really well and generating a lot of publicity. They can also proactively generate revenue for their institution. And the second decision in February of 2024, the NLRB decided that Dartmouth basketball players are considered athletes and thus could unionize, which generally is something you only see from employees. Usually the main sources will be like work unions, for example, and in unions you would pay a portion of your salary generally have in order to have a community of people or a community of people whose main goal is to organize and maintain the workers' rights. But in this case, because they are athletes, then it's more so protecting athletes' rights. But this concept of unionization you would generally only see from employees, so there is already some precedent.
And one more thing about the NCAA versus Alston case, it talks about NIL uses, which is name, image, and likeness, which means that they can do things like make deals with companies, and they can like make money off of things like social media, which previously they couldn't do. So it's pretty much the first way that student athletes are able to make money based on their like personal brand of being a student athlete, like if they're famous. And yeah, it's basically the first form of compensation that students athletes could get off of that, which was created from this case. The other thing, the other thing that this case decided is that the NCAA isn't exempt from antitrust regulations. What antitrust regulations are is basically regulations that that pretty much they do a lot of things, but the main thing they do is they target monopolies so that one company or one organization can't limit like free market competition. So before this, the NCAA, what they did was they tried to skirt antitrust regulations by saying uh they organize amateur sports, so they don't fall under that definition. But then when what this happened is that when it went through the Supreme Court, it struck down that I guess that legal basis that which where they were doing it on. So they couldn't avoid these antitrust regulations anymore. That's going to be another huge argument you get into, because if the NCAA takes up a lot of like the, I guess, employees that student athletes would be considered as, they would have to go through more antitrust regulations that'll probably hurt the NCAA. That's one of the reasons why students aren't considered employees, or at least up to that point, it's because the NCAA was considered an amateur organization, and that was kind of started by this Johnson v. NCAA thing, which is that student athletes are considered amateur, which is kind of like two conflicting court cases that are both upheld at the same time. So that's like one thing you could probably like if you wanted to make, I guess, somewhat of a somewhat unique AF argument, you could probably talk about like conflicting court cases. And then earlier we talked about how the NLRB made a decision about the Dartmouth men's basketball team saying that they could unionize because they were considered employees. However, this doesn't extend to anyone else because the reason that the NLRB decided that the Dartmouth basketball team counted as employees were because they were receiving things compensation in the form of like I think it was equipment and branded gear or something like that, which is kind of dumb. But they said that since other athletes receive other forms of compensation, this decision doesn't necessarily extend to all athletes or not even like all Dartmouth athletes. So it's limited in scope, but if you want any empirics or any like, I guess, merits to any unionization arguments, that's where you would probably get it from.
So some other important terms that you'll probably see in your debates very often, probably glazed over in the constructive speech and never explained ever again, are first the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which established rights specifically for employees. And so if you hear that, that's probably just you could think of it as almost a Bill of Rights for employees. The other terms are the NLRA and NLRB, which are the National Labor Relations Act and the National Labor Relations Board. And the NLRA will protect workers, and the NLRB is what enforces that. So the NLRA is a little bit more similar to the FLSA, and the NLRB is what actually the group of people that are actually enforcing this.
Yeah, and the big parts of the FLSA are the minimum wage and overtime pay, which means that if student athletes were to be considered employees, they would have to be paid minimum wage and they would have to be paid overtime pay for any, I guess, overtime that they work. And then the big thing about, I think the biggest thing that sets the NLRA unique from the FLSA, it also protects the right to do collective bargaining, which we typically see happen through unions, which is a big thing about I guess better working conditions for student athletes. That's a big deal. And then the biggest thing about the NLRB is that A, it enforces the NLRA, but B, any decisions they could make could be overturned by courts. And the Dartmouth decision that we talked about earlier, that's actually gone to the courts to see whether or not it would be overturned because it's not the final arbiter of what's legal or not under the NLRA. Okay, so the arguments we're going to be going over on the AF, compensation, unionization, discrimination, and corrupt boosters. The first three are kind of similar insofar as they talk about like basically better conditions for student athletes, whether it happened through better working conditions or better pay, stuff like that. And then the neg arguments are going to be taxes, school collapse, job market overflow, and lawsuits. Okay. So the first AF argument, I think probably the biggest one you're going to see is compensation. So right now, student athletes, aside from the NIL deals we talked about earlier, they don't get paid whatsoever, especially not by colleges. And a lot of student athletes don't get scholarships. Very few get scholarships. So they also have to pay for college. So when you reclassify student athletes as employees, that means they get protections under the FLSA, which includes the minimum wage and overtime pay, which means that every single athlete will have to get paid for what they do. So the biggest impact for this is obviously decreasing poverty and financial burdens for student athletes and their families. And one financial burden that you could probably talk about is the cost of college for these non-scholarship athletes. They have to pay a lot of money to go to college. They don't get paid for sports. And oftentimes, doing sports takes away from their ability to like get jobs and also takes away from their ability to do well in school. So what you're doing is you're giving them an alternate source of money so that they don't have to get a job, because the time burden of sports often prevents them from getting a job because it takes so long. And that would probably decrease poverty. You could also probably find evidence about how college prices increase poverty. I know that was a big thing on the student loans topic, and if you have backfiles from there, you could probably use them. The biggest response is that student athletes, a lot of them do get scholarships, so a lot of them won't be facing the burden of having to pay for college. But then I think the biggest response will be that this Alston v. NCAA case, it created the ability for student athletes to get compensation, and they can get it like right now. I think it's Texas A&M, and every student on their football team gets an NIL deal. So a lot of colleges are already basically indirectly paying their athletes. And then the second way they get paid, it's not on the slide, but they get paid by these things called boosters, which basically they gift athletes, or they give them money as compensation. I'll get into the problems with that later, but that's probably the biggest way that the neg's gonna respond to this, just basically non-uniquing the argument and saying everything that they talk about is probably happening right now. It's definitely happening to a lot smaller of a scale, but that's the biggest response you're gonna get. Okay. The second argument is unionization. So student athletes, once again, they have long hours, they don't get paid, they're overworked, and they often can't get jobs and ignore school. So when you reclassify them as employees, that means they're able to unionize. The I th the I think it's the NLRB came to a decision a while ago that only employees are allowed to join unions, no one else can, which means that currently student athletes aren't able to join unions. The biggest empiric of reclassification allowing the formation of unions is the Dartmouth decision, which under that decision, there's evidence out there saying how it paved the way for students to join unions. So that's the biggest empiric. And what that'll do is that unions create better and safer working conditions, which reduces athletes, and reduces injuries and betters education. So when you have unions, what you're going to be seeing is that you're going to be seeing probably that student athletes have to do less work for sports, and they can focus on doing things like getting their degree, getting better grades. And you can probably link it to something like an innovation impact there. The other big argument is reducing injuries. We've seen a lot of like career-ending injuries because of things like overwork. And I think there's been 20 something deaths because of college athletes being overworked in the last decade. So that's the biggest thing, is if you create labor unions for these athletes to join, they're going to have the ability to collectively bargain. They're going to have the ability to do things like going on strike to better their conditions, which means you're going to see less overwork, less ending injuries, and fewer deaths, because we have seen deaths once again because of overwork. One response you're going to get is that there are some regulations that exist to reduce overwork, which is basically saying that there definitely are some laws in place that prevent certain things from happening to athletes, but B, a lot of colleges also have regulations that prevent athletes from working too hard. The problem with these regulations is that they don't often get enforced, especially if they're college level policies and not actual laws. So what unionization would do is it would allow for the enforcement of that through things like collective bargaining and strikes. The other major thing you're going to see is that unions are bad, especially since we had the right to work topic last year. There's definitely a lot of backfells on why unions are a bad thing because of things like corruption. Obviously, there's also ways around this, but yeah, I would say probably watch out for these union bad turns that you're going to get. Okay. The third major thing you're going to see is that student athletes are being discriminated against, especially by coaches. This includes things like sexual harassment and just general like racism and sexism. That happens in a lot of sports. So what the link is that the FLSA, once again coming in clutch, it gives student athletes, or it gives all employees the right to be free from discrimination, and it gives them the right to pursue lawsuits without facing retaliation. So if you're reclassifying student athletes as employees, it gives them protection under the FLSA, which means A, discrimination isn't allowed to happen legally speaking, and B, if it does happen, then student athletes could sue and they won't be afraid of being cut from the team, having their pay docked, getting less playing time, things like that. One big impact to this is obviously discrimination, which is in and of itself a bad thing. And if you're running something like a structural violence framing, you probably don't need much of like an impact other than discrimination is happening right now. But then the second major thing is that when you're being discriminated against by coaches, by the coaching staff, it deters participation in sports, meaning, and it also deters, like, I guess it kind of deters people from wanting to participate in college as a whole. So you're going to see decreased athletic performance and decreased performance in school. And that's a bad thing because it's bad for the students, first of all. But second of all, there's a lot of studies out there that talk about how sports actually increase funding for schools by increasing things like donations and increase the amount of people applying to those schools, so that you're going to see less funding going to those schools overall, which A, might hurt more athletes in turn because you're going to have lower salaries, but also B, hurt some of the research initiatives that these colleges are doing, which have broader implications on research, things like climate change, healthcare, because if you're having less funding, less research, less innovation. One of the biggest responses, obviously, is that colleges definitely do have policies against discrimination, but once again, they're not enforced very strictly, especially because coaches are being paid millions of dollars, and it's not very easy to fire a coach for something like harassment or discrimination. But you could run this in tandem with the unionization argument, which is basically talking about how under the NLRA, students would be able to legally do lawsuits, and they would be able to unionize to fire coaches, things like that. Another major argument you're probably going to see, another major response you're going to see here is that not all donations and not all applications come necessarily from athletics. And if you decrease the amount of you're probably not going to decrease the amount of athletes as a whole. They might move to other colleges, but in that case, you don't really see an impact with deterring participation because they're doing the same thing but at a different college, and those colleges are getting the benefits. So there's no net decrease in things like funding for colleges. There's only a decrease at this one college. Okay. One big problem with the Alston v NCAA case is that it created these boosters, and boosters are basically allowed to give gifts to student athletes for NIL deals. So the way they do this is they give money away to students, but that's less common. What's more common is that they give students things like cars and other like big ticket gifts to incentivize them to join schools and to do better. And a lot of times these NIL deals are pretty fake too. They're not actually using their name, image, and likeness. They're just using that as a guise to just pay these students. There's stories of students like doing small time filming, and that counts as an NIL deal because they're like credited as a camera person. And they're basically creating fake NIL deals to give students gifts. So when you reclassify students as employees, you don't need these boosters anymore. And instead, you can have colleges paying athletes. So students are less incentivized to take gifts from these boosters, and these boosters will probably cease to exist. The problem with these boosters is that there's a lot of corruption going on, which can decrease the reputation of the school. It can lose money from the school, but also there's a lot of discrimination going on within these boosters. And there's a lot of favoritism where these boosters aren't willing to pay for certain sports. They aren't willing to pay certain athletes. And the other major thing is that there's a lot of bribes, which has an economic impact on the colleges, which once again probably takes away from funding for things like research and the innovation that these colleges are doing. The problem with this argument is that when you reclassify students, these boosters probably will still exist because they still want like to retain certain athletes. Like if an athlete is thinking of transferring to another school, these boosters might step in, give this athlete gifts to prevent them from transferring, which means they will still exist. This corruption will still exist. The other thing is that discrimination and favoritism will probably still exist. If a college is really focused on a sport like football, they're definitely going to give more money to their football players than they would other sports players, which still creates discrimination and favoritism with sports. The other thing is that I talked about the economic impact of the corruption we see earlier and how colleges are losing money because of parent boosters. That economic impact on colleges will probably still happen because they have to pay a lot of money for these salaries, which will also decrease innovation. So I think just thematically with the AF, the biggest thing is just securing the protections from the FLSA and the NLRA for students that will increase compensation, it'll better colleges, and it'll decrease corruption. And if you're arguing for the AF side, what I would recommend doing is probably reading more in depth into the FLSA and the NLRA and reading more in depth into like what's happening to student athletes and how they're being mistreated and exploited right now, so that when you reclassify them, they gain these protections and we see that discrimination, we see that exploitation decreasing. That's probably the biggest thing you want to be doing for the AF to find arguments outside of this lecture. Okay. Now we're going to be moving on to the negs, so Daniel's going to do this part.
Yeah, move on.
Oh, yeah.
It's fine, yeah. Okay, so remember when Ishaan said that there's probably not going to be a way to spin big stick extinction nuclear war impacts on this topic? Yeah, the keyword there is probably because I actually found a way, and that is with taxes. So when you are employed somewhere, say you just got a job, I don't know, just anywhere, and you take home your first paycheck, and it's missing about 20% of what you expected. That 20% immediately will go to federal income tax, and from there will also be state income tax, et cetera, et cetera. But the main concern that we have here is federal income tax, and this will come into play especially when you look at the current situation in Israel and Palestine, where the United States is sending a lot of tax money to specifically Israel for defense funding. They're using defense funding, which is partially derived from tax dollars, and using some of that to support allies in Israel. And with that, what happens when you create a bunch of new employees who generate massive amounts of revenue for a school is that more likely than not they'll be paid a very large amount of money as a salary. And the way that federal income tax works is it's not a fixed amount, it's instead a percentage, and that percentage is based on how much income you have, which places you into certain taxing brackets. Long story short, the more money you have, the more money the government gets. And through this, you get thousands of athletes that are now recognized as employees. You have these athletes being recognized as deserving of at least minimum wage, and probably a lot more to keep them on the team, and also because of how much revenue they make for the colleges. And now you have a giant stream of money going towards the government. And as I said before, the government also branches off into a defense portion, and this defense portion funds allies in Israel. Where's this all going? Well, the link chain of this argument is that the AF will create a lot of new tax revenue through previously unheard of income taxes that increases defense budget and increases the amount of money that the United States can spend in the Israel-Palestine region. And by doing this, there's more weaponry and tools of warfare available, thus resulting in more conflict. And there's some evidence for this. If you want to look into it, a good place to start would be actually the open case list for the current LD topic, because a lot of people are arguing about entanglement in the Israel-Palestine region. But in general, the entanglement in the Israel-Palestine region, there is a lot of evidence saying that probably will not go according to plan, probably will not go very well, and a lot of people are dying, and by increasing the amount of money we spend on tools of mass destruction, well, that toll of people dying will increase. And so the impact is, well, traditional nuclear war. But what if you are on your local circuit and you have a parent judge who thinks that these technical extinction first arguments are stupid, and we need to be judged on our suits and stuff. No hate to parent judges, but for parent judges, there's also an alternative link. There's also an alternative path you can take with this argument, which is that the government getting a lot more government tax revenue all of a sudden, it'll cause greater political polarization. One of the hot button issues for pretty much any election, regardless of whether or not either party follows through with it, is the question of taxation. And generally, people don't want as much taxation. So when the government gets a lot more tax revenue, it's not necessarily direct additional percentages. Instead, the government still gets more money to spend, and in that case, the the whole government versus anti-government debate kicks off back again of how much control the government should actually have over citizens' money. And in doing this, and this kind of jumps to another point, but there is historical precedent for it. So the 2016 election, it was probably one of the most polar elections in America's history. And what happens when an election becomes very polar and both political sides become open to slander and borderline entertainment news, etc. You get populist candidates, and populist candidates don't really care as much about US policy as they do about, well, as the name suggests, being popular. And as a result, we have historical precedent that when populists get elected, they create bad policy, which messes up the United States political system. So if you are at, for example, the TOC Digital 3 tournament, then maybe you should err on the side of reading the extinction part. But if you are doing NSDA NAT calls or something like that, then probably go for the populism impact.
And you could always, if you're on the app, you could probably also say, like, you could probably turn the internal link and just say tax money going to Israel is a good thing.
Yeah, so the second argument is school collapse. So there's a lot of cases. The ones that I know the most about are in various schools in the SEC, the Southeastern Conference of schools, all generally associated with football. That football was what actually got a lot of these schools their student popularity, going from relatively small state institutions to schools where people from around the country are actively applying to and seeking out in order to go. And so the amount of money that student athletes bring to colleges, aside from just NIL deals, also include the extent of things like tuition and profit from housing and dining expenses, books, etc. And all of these things are sources of revenue for the college. So what happens when universities are now forced by labor laws to pay their hundreds of athletes? They lose a lot of that money, and as a result have to start cutting budget that they would not have otherwise, because because first of all, they are already getting they're sometimes getting already a form of like a tuition grant or some other scholarship. And on top of this, colleges spend arguably way, or especially colleges in prominent athletic conferences like the Big Ten, the SEC, etc., probably spend a lot of their money, arguably too much of their money, on sporting programs. And so by forcing them to pay out their athletes even more of that money, and most likely is going to be a fairly large comparative percentage to the amount that they generate the school, they will probably be incentivized to do either one of two things. One, go bankrupt, which I'm going to guess they're probably not going to, and that's probably going to be very difficult to argue against. But the other option is they just cut athletic programs and reduce the number of athletes they have, as to reduce the amount of people that they have to put on their payroll. And in doing this, this will completely backfire and cause popularity of these schools to collapse, and resulting in less students. For example, if you are an avid Ohio fan and they completely drop the football program, you would probably not be an avid Ohio fan anymore, and probably would not consider the school anymore. And if you were to be an avid Ohio fan, then probably thousands upon thousands of other potential students, money making sources with, say, an average of about 40K a student for tuition and living expenses for public schools, even more so for private schools. The schools will just immediately lose all of this income that they've been getting from their popularity. Now, granted, this will completely bankrupt them, but they will lose a lot of their revenue, especially schools in prominent athletic conferences. And so as a result, the schools will lose a bunch of funding, and it will lead to schools being unable to provide financial aid grants and other resources generally targeted towards poor and low middle income class students who either cannot outright pay for college or will have a very, very difficult time and a bunch of loans trying to pay for college. And so this is a more comparable impact to most of the stuff that we've talked about on the AF, where it's an inequality impact, but so it could probably you could probably have a likelihood debate on this versus any one of the other inequality impacts on the AF. But the one problem with this argument that I see, and this is not to dissuade you from reading the argument, because all arguments have flaws, it's just something that you should probably be prepared to respond to, is that this argument relies on a lot of probability guessing and assumption. And that's especially prominent with with two things. First, the amount of money that these schools will lose from cutting athletic programs, and second, the amount of athletics programs they cut. And actually, there's a third that I just remembered, which is the amount of money they have from other sources. But at the end of the day, that probably will not be as prominent for a lot of schools in prominent athletic conferences of because of where they get a lot of their revenue. They probably will not be getting as much from billionaire grants as they will from sports Saturdays and ticketed events and influxes of students. So, job market overflow. If anyone here is planning on going into computer science, you probably know that it's an awful idea right now just because of the amount of overflow in the job market. And this is kind of what the contention is based around. So the uniqueness is after COVID, during COVID, the job market started to decline pretty quickly as a lot of people were laid off due to health concerns and other regulations. And as of now, the job market is recovering. You can go onto Google, you can look it up. There is a lot of evidence for saying that the job market is recovering. And from this, more jobs are available. Jobs are definitely looking better than they were during the pandemic. And people generally are having a easier time getting employed in most fields. And the link is that the app gives thousands of athletes quote unquote work experience, emboldening thousands of applications. And this is not necessarily to dissuade, this contention does not necessarily say that athletes should not apply for work. It's just saying that a lot of the work experience they have is generally inflated and will probably cause a massive influx in the job market what job of what hirers are either seeing as either overinflated work experience that probably doesn't mean much, or very good work experience that has a giant impact that causes them to overlook possibly more specialized candidates for the job. And as a result, it will probably result in the second version of the second coming of the current computer science job market, where finding even an internship is a pain that requires hundreds of applications for not even a guaranteed result. And this isn't even the final impact because this isn't really contextualized to what will happen as a result of the second CS job market. And this is that a lot of the times when people go to college, they take on massive amounts of student loan debt. And with this student loan debt compounded with the fact that they can't really earn money after college because of this inflated job market, it will lead to a bunch of very large amount of widespread student poverty just because they leave school, they either have inflated work experience in the case of athletes or no work or little to no work experience in the case of most students, and they're stuck with a loan, so that's negative money, and have no positive source of income, which in turn leads to mass widespread student poverty. And you can adjust the scale of this impact using different types of evidence depending on the type of judge you're trying to win over. Okay, so lawsuits. So if you've ever seen videos of college football fans, for example, you can pretty much clearly see that they do some pretty crazy stuff in support of a bunch of undergraduate students on the football field. And this isn't to discredit the programs, but college fans are pretty dedicated. So what happens if you recognize student athletes as employees of their school? It will give these employees also a legal connection to their school, which means that they're not necessarily legal representatives of their school, but they are legally representative of their school. And the distinction there is that they're not like lawyers, for example, but they do have the ability to create an image for the school that can cast the school into either illegal or illegal, and subsequently make the school or subsequently cause this school to be perceived as committing legal or illegal actions in a court of law. And so you see these college fanboys and fangirls. You see people who would do anything for their favorite college team, generally in larger conferences, but in general, you see these hyper dedicated sports fans, and you also have seen a lot of crazy stuff that has happened in the past with other types of groups and their fans. And I'm not going to go into detail about that now, but the general idea is that dedicated fans can and most likely will spend a lot of their time and money generating frivolous lawsuits to either slow down teams they don't like or to get players that they don't like completely removed, or as a third option, just take revenge on the school that beat them on in the semifinals of X tournament. And as a result, the schools have to face these lawsuits. They're not going to lose a bunch of their money uncontested, and they really probably do not want to lose all this money to a random Tennessee fan to some random, like, I don't know, 30-year-old Tennessee fan who just doesn't like them because they who doesn't like them because they were beaten by or because they were beaten by, I don't know, Auburn, for example. And so they send a bunch of frivolous lawsuits over to the school, and the school answers them. And as a result, the school legal department and most likely the athletes as well lose a lot of their time and especially money. Lawyers aren't cheap, and there's a reason why legal battles, especially against companies, are long and difficult because the process isn't a fast one and it's a very financially draining one. And so once people catch on, this will probably become very prevalent, draining colleges of their reserve funds. And this is a similar impact that you've seen to the to the school collapse argument, where schools' loss of funding results in less financial aid programs, less scholarship programs, less opportunities for people to go to their school, and also subsequently reducing the quality of research and other educational programs that the school puts out, which overall leads to a bunch of impacts that you could probably classify as structural violence, which means that these impacts too will compete under and under a structural violence framework and compete against a lot of the arguments that we went over in the AF. And at that point, it just becomes it becomes twofold. It becomes a probability weighing game, and it becomes a very and it also becomes a magnitude weighing game. The problem with scope here is that it's pretty difficult to exactly quantify this, but in the case of magnitude, it might be somewhat easier just because you can classify fan bases as more dedicated, less dedicated, based on past precedent, etc. And at the end of the day, it'll just become a impact battle drill, and that you have to win.